The night shift has a rhythm that only a few people ever really understand. Around 2 in the morning, the world grows quieter, conversations fade, and the roads empty out until the only sounds left are the hum of a coffee machine and the occasional car passing in the distance. At the Silver Star Diner just outside Barstow, California, Grace Miller had lived inside that rhythm for more than 3 decades. 32 years behind the counter had taught her something about people, especially the kind who wander into diners long after midnight. You learn to recognize loneliness when you see it. Truck drivers stopping for caffeine after endless miles, teenagers killing time because home feels too small, travelers between places, between decisions, between versions of themselves. Grace knew these patterns the way a sailor knows the tide. She poured coffee, wiped counters, refilled napkin holders, and kept the quiet company of strangers whose names she might never learn. Most nights passed in exactly the same way, predictable and calm, the kind of routine that settles into your bones after enough years. But sometimes, very rarely, something small would break that rhythm. That night, it happened when the diner door opened at 2:15 a.m. 2 men stepped inside. Nothing about them seemed remarkable at first glance. They wore simple work shirts, jeans, and baseball caps, the kind of clothes you'd expect from travelers driving long distances through the desert. They didn't look around much. They didn't speak loudly. They simply walked to the counter and sat down. Grace greeted them with the same practiced warmth she'd offered thousands of customers before. "Coffee?" she asked. They nodded politely. "Just coffee for now." Something about their presence was different, though it was hard to explain why. Maybe it was the way they carried themselves, calm and unhurried, as if time wasn't chasing them the way it chased everyone else on the highway. Maybe it was the quiet understanding between them, the kind of silence shared by people who didn't feel the need to fill every moment with words. Grace poured their coffee and went back to wiping the counter. Outside, the highway stretched into darkness. Inside, the diner felt almost suspended in time. And if you had been sitting there that night, watching those 2 quiet men sip their coffee while an exhausted waitress moved through her familiar routine, you might have felt it too. That subtle sense that something unusual was unfolding, even though nothing dramatic had happened yet. Because sometimes the most important moments don't announce themselves loudly. Sometimes they begin in silence, in the quiet corner of a nearly empty diner, with 2 strangers who seem completely ordinary, until you realize they're not. Grace Miller had spent most of her life standing behind that counter, though if you asked her, she would probably say the diner had simply become part of who she was. 32 years is a long time to do anything, but the overnight shift carries a special kind of weight. It changes the way you experience time. While most of the world sleeps, you're pouring coffee, wiping counters, and watching strangers pass through like brief chapters in a book you never get to finish. When Grace first started, she was young enough that the long hours didn't seem like much of a sacrifice. Back then, the night shift was just a way to earn steady money while the world was busy fighting a war far away. Her husband was overseas, and every paycheck felt like a small promise that life would eventually settle into something normal. But life has a way of stretching those temporary arrangements into decades before you even notice. Years passed quietly and steadily. She learned how to carry 3 plates in one hand without spilling a drop. She learned how to read the mood of a customer before they even spoke. And most of all, she learned something deeper about the people who sit across a counter at 2 in the morning. You see, the night crowd is different. During the day, diners are full of noise and quick conversations, people rushing from one responsibility to the next. But at 2 in the morning, the walls seem to listen. The stories people carry start to slip out between sips of coffee. A truck driver might mention the miles still waiting ahead of him. A tired young couple might whisper about dreams that feel too fragile to say out loud. Grace heard thousands of those fragments over the years, but the strange thing is that very few people ever asked about her life in return. That's the quiet truth about work like hers. When you're the one serving, refilling, and keeping the night moving forward, you become part of the background of other people's stories. And if you've ever spent years being the listener in other people's lives, you know what that feels like. You become skilled at asking questions, at nodding with patience, at offering warmth without expecting anything back. Yet somewhere beneath the routine, there's still a human heart carrying its own memories, its own losses, its own quiet victories.
Grace rarely talked about those things, not because they didn't matter, but because life had trained her to keep moving. Coffee refilled, plates cleared, counters wiped. Another customer comes, another conversation passes through, and the night continues exactly as it always has. But every now and then, something shifts, and when it does, the person who has spent years listening might finally discover what it feels like to be heard. After pouring their coffee, Grace returned to her quiet routine. The counter needed another wipe, the napkin holders needed straightening, and there were a few small tasks left before the end of her shift. Her body moved automatically, guided by habits formed over decades. Yet the long hours were beginning to settle into her back and shoulders the way they often did near the end of the night. Almost without thinking, she let out a small sigh and mentioned how long the shift had been. One of the men looked up from his coffee. His expression wasn't dramatic or exaggerated. It was simply attentive, the kind of attention people rarely offer strangers anymore. "That's a long shift," he said gently. "You must be tired." It was such a simple observation, but something about the way he said it made Grace pause. Most customers nodded politely and returned to their own conversations. Very few actually sounded as though they were ready to listen to whatever answer might follow. "Since yesterday evening," she replied with a small smile. 9 hours on my feet." The second man leaned forward slightly, not intruding, just showing the quiet curiosity of someone who genuinely cared. 9 hours? He asked. "How long have you been doing the overnight shift?" That question opened a door Grace hadn't expected to walk through. 32 years, she said. And then something subtle happened, the kind of shift that often begins with one sincere question. The men didn't rush to fill the silence afterward. They simply waited, not impatiently, not awkwardly, just patiently enough to make it clear that her answer mattered. So Grace kept talking. She mentioned how she started working nights when she was young, back when her husband was serving overseas. She talked about the way the diner used to be busier long past midnight when the highway carried more travelers through town. Back then, the nights moved quickly. Orders came and went, laughter echoed across the counter, and the hours slipped by before anyone noticed. But time changes places the same way it changes people. The highway shifted, traffic moved elsewhere, the nights grew quieter, and somewhere along the way, Grace realized she had spent most of her life watching the world pass through that doorway while she stayed in the same place behind the counter. Yet the memories she carried were anything but small. She talked about her husband and the years they built together, the ordinary routines that once felt permanent. She described the pride she felt raising her daughter, the small victories that only parents truly understand. Then her voice softened when she mentioned the harder moments, the kind life introduces without warning: loss, loneliness, the strange adjustment that comes when a house once filled with conversation grows quiet. Through it all, the two men remained exactly the same. They didn't interrupt. They didn't rush her forward. Occasionally, one of them asked a quiet question that showed he had been listening closely, the kind of question that gently opened another memory rather than closing the subject. And something subtle began to happen inside that nearly empty diner. Grace wasn't just passing time anymore. She was remembering pieces of her life that had been tucked away behind years of routine. Moments of happiness, moments of heartbreak, moments that shaped who she had become. Have you ever experienced something like that? That rare feeling when someone isn't waiting for their turn to speak, when they're not glancing at a clock or searching for the next thing to say. It's a powerful thing being heard like that.
The minutes slipped by almost unnoticed. Coffee cups were refilled, but the conversation never lost its gentle rhythm. What started as a brief exchange between strangers slowly turned into something deeper, something warmer, something unexpectedly human.
Grace had spent decades listening to other people share fragments of their lives across that same counter. Night after night she had nodded, smiled, and offered quiet understanding while strangers unburdened themselves before continuing down the road. But this time, the roles had quietly reversed. For once, she was the one being heard. And as the conversation stretched closer to 40 minutes, a quiet realization began to settle in the room. Something meaningful was unfolding there, something neither Grace nor the two men had planned when they first walked through that door. Sometimes, a conversation changes everything without anyone realizing it in the moment. Grace leaned back slightly, a pause settling over her after nearly 40 minutes of uninterrupted sharing. For the first time, she realized something she hadn't thought to ask: their names. She had been speaking for what felt like an eternity, offering pieces of her life to strangers, and in all that time, she hadn't even asked who they were. It was such a small detail, yet in that moment it seemed monumental. How often do we overlook the simplest things in the midst of profound experiences? How often do we forget that even those we think of as strangers carry their own significance, their own presence in our lives? One of the men smiled gently and said, "I'm Paul." The other followed with an equally calm, "I'm Robert." There was no fanfare, no announcement, no expectation that this should matter. Just two names, spoken quietly, almost humbly. And then Grace looked closer, really looked, beyond the ordinary exterior of the two men who had been sitting silently, attentively for nearly an hour. Recognition dawned like sunlight breaking through a long, dark night. It was Paul Newman and Robert Redford, two faces she had seen countless times on magazine covers, movie posters, and screens across the country. They were iconic, larger than life, and yet here they were, present, patient, and listening with full attention. Her breath caught, and the realization overwhelmed her. Can you imagine that moment? That instant when the world shifts slightly, when the ordinary perception of reality fractures and something extraordinary pierces through? The men she had been speaking to, sharing her history with, trusting with her memories, were people whose fame could have changed the dynamic entirely. But instead, they remained grounded, focused entirely on her story. The contrast between the life she thought she was living and this moment of recognition created an emotional intensity she had not anticipated. A mixture of disbelief, awe, and gratitude welled up within her. How often do we underestimate the impact of attention, of being truly heard, until it is given by someone whose own life is already filled with accolades and admiration? That night, Grace realized not only that her life had mattered, but that the quiet act of listening can transform ordinary moments into memories that endure far longer than we expect, leaving marks not just on our own hearts, but on the hearts of those who receive our trust. Paul and Robert didn't linger on their own identities. There was no expectation that Grace should be awed or that the moment should shift towards them. Instead, they leaned in just enough to offer words that carried far more weight than fame ever could. "Grace," Paul said quietly, "your story matters. Thank you for trusting us with it." There was no grand gesture, no attempt to dramatize the encounter. It was the simplicity of their acknowledgement that made it remarkable. Can you feel how rare that is, to have someone genuinely affirm the value of your life without asking anything in return? To hear that what you've lived, what you've endured, what you've loved and lost is significant to another human being? It's a moment that lingers in a way that no applause ever could. Robert added softly, "We are honored that you shared your life with us tonight. Every detail, every memory, it matters." And in that small, ordinary diner, a powerful truth revealed itself. The greatest impact doesn't come from accolades, fame, or recognition from the outside world. It comes from presence, from attention, from the rare act of listening with complete sincerity.
That night, Grace learned that her decades of ordinary work, her long nights, her quiet moments of care for strangers had not gone unnoticed. They had been witnessed, they had been valued, and they had left a mark on two people whose own lives were filled with extraordinary moments. The contrast between the glamour she had never sought and the simple human connection she received made the memory all the more unforgettable. Isn't it remarkable how one act of listening, one acknowledgement of existence, can transform an ordinary evening into something that echoes across a lifetime? Years later, Grace would often think back to that night and realize how quietly transformative it had been. It wasn't the celebrity of the men who had visited her that mattered, nor the unexpected fame that could have accompanied such an encounter. What stayed with her was something far simpler, yet infinitely more profound: the act of being fully seen, fully heard, and valued without condition. How often do we move through life without giving that gift to others, without pausing long enough to listen with genuine attention? How often do we underestimate the power of presence, the quiet dignity of listening? That night, Grace reminded her that the greatest gestures need not be grand or expensive. Sometimes the most meaningful moments arise from the simplest of actions. She carried that lesson forward, remembering that human connection, empathy, and patience can leave a lasting mark on a person's heart. And in thinking about her own life, she realized that every life, no matter how ordinary it seems, deserves to be honored, deserves to be heard, and deserves the respect of someone willing to truly listen. Isn't it remarkable that something as simple as paying attention could resonate so deeply, echoing across years, across lives, and quietly shaping the way we see ourselves and one another?